Hello, and welcome to another episode of Spy Talk. Today, the topic of discussion is political repression and how to fight it. There's been a drastic uptick in political repression throughout the West, especially but not exclusively against pro-Palestinian activists. In this episode, we want to dive into some of the reasons for why we're seeing this, what to do about it, and crucially, why aren't we seeing more of a fight back against this on part of the unions and the left? With me to discuss these are Comrades Kat and Kate from the Partisan Defence Committee, which is a defence organisation linked to the Spartacus League. Welcome, comrades.
Thanks for having us.
Hi. So let's just get right into it. I mean, maybe you can start by giving us some context of what this repression looks like and the spread of it, the intensity of it.
So everywhere, not just in Britain, but across the Western countries and beyond, there's been a whole slew of repression, arrests, jailing, prosecutions of activists who are defending Palestine, who are opposed to the genocide that we've been seeing since October 1923. 2023. And this has gotten very pronounced. Here in Britain, we have been to countless demonstrations at courthouses defending people who are being hauled through the so-called justice system for things like standing up for the right of the Palestinians to defend themselves, that kind of thing, and being branded as terrorists for doing so.
Yeah, and then, other examples is, the Party for Socialism and Liberation in the U.S. got a letter from the Department of Homeland Security, totally intimidating them for their role in the anti-ICE protest in California. You have dock workers in Sweden. You have union activists in Canada being gone after. It's a really broad range of people and organizations that are being targeted increasingly by state repression.
Right. Now, why is this happening? Of course, the wind in the West especially is turning to the right. But maybe you can help us understand, why does that necessarily mean more political repression against individuals who are trying to stand up for what they deem to be the right thing?
Well, the right-wing shift in particularly the West is a really key element of it. And with U.S. imperialism trying to reassert its hegemony, it means that the rest of the governments have to either fall in line with what the measures are of U.S. imperialism, or they don't really have that many other alternatives. And that means sort of regimenting the society, really going after people who put up some kind of resistance to that. Obviously, the U.S. imperialists have a very keen interest in assisting or, backing Israel's genocide against the Palestinians, which means people who oppose it in the current climate are a particular target, because that's what it means, when you have this rightward shift and you don't really have the room for the nice, liberal protest movements that can, try to pressure the imperialists or make them. The U.S. doesn't have that pretense at the moment, and so everybody else is kind of falling in line, and that means increase in the repression against their own population.
I would just add that this has gone pretty far, to the point where not just here in Britain, here in Britain, the government feels that it can impose outright bans on particular organizations, criminalizing them, their existence, or anyone who supports them. And they've so far been able to get away with that.
On the face of it, there's been sizable pro-Palestinian movement, right, in many countries throughout the world, but especially in the West. We've seen very large demonstrations in many, many cities. So there is a lot of support. At the same time, there's a bit of a contradiction that you've got mass support, yet the state is actually going after people.
A bit of a contradiction and a very bad situation, actually, for the pro-Palestinian movement. What I would note is that the movement, although large and broad, has been toothless. It has not actually had a real effect, because in order to do that, it would have to take on the pro-Zionists, like the Starmer government, for example, directly. And it refuses to do that. I think this is the case in other countries as well. So it hasn't had an effect.
I think this is something we'll come back to, because whereas we're stating this as a fact, this is a very controversial opinion that the movement hasn't been effective or isn't strong enough or so on and so forth. Because I know from arguments with leftists, with people on the demonstrations, that there's this feeling of we're creating all this awareness for the Palestinian cause and so on. Okay, fine, there's awareness. But if you have hundreds and thousands of people on the street protesting for months and months and months and over, a year, yet these governments, instead of backing off or thinking twice, for example, let's take the example of NECAP, right? Very prominent.
Yep.
And their case has gotten quite a lot of attention because they're merging the cause of Ireland and Palestine, which is a very popular thing, of course. But, the government, instead of thinking twice and three times about, well, this won't look good, they decided to actually double down. But why does the government feel so emboldened to do this, despite there being a empirically sizable movement?
Well, again, there is a sizable movement. There'll be hundreds of thousands of people out on the streets on a given Saturday demonstrating. But what does it achieve? It doesn't actually present any real formidable obstacle to the government. Here's what I mean by that. A formidable obstacle would be if the dockers unions refused to handle the military goods going to Israel, or workers in factories refused to produce them, or that would be a formidable obstacle to the imperialists and to the lackeys of the imperialists. But that does not exist in any mass way.
One of the things we have come across in these demonstrations is actually kind of the question why, after almost 2 years of mass protests on the street, it really hasn't accomplished very much. And I think the leadership of those demonstrations are very much tied in their own ways to the Starmer government and don't present a strategy that actually challenges the foreign policy and the interests of the British ruling class. So if you adapt your demands or do it on the basis of moral outrage, as opposed to here is a program for actually struggling, what does it take to stop the genocide in Gaza? Then of course, you're gutting the potential that's there in the anger amongst the population to want to oppose and fight against this genocide.
I think in what both of you just said, we're already transitioning towards what to do and why it's not being done. So why don't we start by first talking about, okay, there's obviously a problem. Repression is increasing instead of, the opposite. So this is a communist podcast. What do we as communists have to say about what should be done to fight this? And obviously we base ourselves on the history of the Marxist movement, of the labor movement, and there are lessons to be learned from that movement in terms of what we put forward on the ground today in our propaganda. So could you walk our listeners through what, so to speak, communist strategy of fighting against political repression looks like?
Yes, we are not the originators of communist defense work, United Front defense work, I could say, at all. It's a long tradition, and it goes back to the Comintern, the Communist International, or even before that, if you like, to the Bolsheviks, who had United Front actions against, for example, Kornilov, the fascist general who was poised to crush the proletariat just before the revolution, and he was repelled by a united front of the Bolshevik Party, the Mensheviks, the Socialist Revolution, all the parties who stood to be crushed. Mm-hmm. Okay, so the Communist International, it passed an important resolution, 1922, at its fourth Congress, that sort of codified what needed to be happening. It was in the context of a renewed onslaught against the working class all over the capitalist world. And so this was in their theses on tactics. I'm just going to read a short little quote from this thesis, which was that the United Front tactic is an initiative for united struggle of the communists with all workers who belong to other parties and groups, with all unaligned workers, to defend the most basic vital interests of the working class against the bourgeoisie. So that's sort of it in a nutshell.
And then that tradition was also taken on outside of Russia and the Comintern Red Aid campaigns. You had American Trotskyists, or, at that point, communist James P. Cannon and some of his co-thinkers who took that thesis and then applied it to the American terrain. And at the time, in 1925, 26, when it was founded, on the basis of what Kate just read out, they really made it a broad defense organization, whether it's Sacco and Mansetti, whether it's the McNamara brothers, whether it's, in these cases, you can obviously look them up more. There's plenty of material available on them, and really try to mobilize on a non-sectarian, i.e. it doesn't matter which political organization you belong to, what your, background is, what your ideology is, that if you are in the crosshairs of the state for your union activities, for your political activity in the interest of the working class, there needs to be united front defense for those cases. And we always say that we base ourselves on the traditions of the ILD, and that is exactly what we're talking about. So this is definitely not a new concept. This has been around for 100 years. And that's what we're really talking about in terms of what is actually needed and necessary in order to defend and strengthen the working class. And that was really the other point that Cannon made, that you need to strengthen the working class against the attacks of the bosses. And that's not done on an individual basis, but it's done through united front action.
I mean, that sounds like a very obvious and commonsensical approach, right? Look, a worker over there is being attacked. We should all get together and fight back. Okay, I can understand that. Now, some of what you said, Kate, for example, you said the need to show that to fight back against that attack is in the interest. It's in the most basic interest of the working class. I think that's one thing I'd like to pick up on. And I think second, about strengthening the class as a whole. I think it's one thing if somebody's being gone after on the job. In that case, it could be obvious to a worker, well, that could be me tomorrow or the next month. But when we're talking about, of course, there's a ton of genuinely decent people who are outraged by the genocide, but it does not necessarily translate into action, or that action is just marching, periodically in the streets of London. Now, I think my question to you would be, how does an event happening across the world, why is that in the interest of the working class, right? Why is fighting back against pro-Palestinian repression? Why is that a cause that is linked to the cause of the working class? Why should British workers here fight for it? Because I think, and this is where it gets a little bit more murky and complicated, and again, we're just talking about Britain for now, but I'm sure this is true for many other countries. Look at the polls. A lot of workers look to Farage today. And a lot of workers voted Labour as well. Labour, backing the genocide. So I think this is, yes, a commonsensical idea that makes a lot of sense. However, I think how do we try and go out to workers and motivate that, hey, this is a cause that you need to fight for? What is that answer?
I don't think these kinds of oppression and repression are isolated things. They're linked together. You have the British ruling class very subservient to American imperialism. They have been for many decades. They will do what they are told by Trump and every other U.S. president for yonks. And they're Zionists in their own right, but they are also going to carry out the diktats of U.S. imperialism. Okay, that means certain things. It means repressing the pro-Palestinian protests. It also means here at home repressing workers who are sticking their heads up in opposition to attacks of that same ruling class on the British working class, on British workers, which are coming thick and fast right now. And so it's in the interest of British workers to oppose what their government is doing to them and abroad to other workers. It's part of the same problem.
In addition, I think this is definitely true. Also, a strengthened ruling class that feels the wind in its sails, it's much easier for them to also then impose austerity measures. So it goes really to the question of the living and working conditions here, that are also under attack. It's not an accident that you see, on the one hand, increased repression, politically speaking, and on the other hand, also austerity measures being implemented, and not just in Britain, but it's, definitely in the US. I mean, that's pretty obvious, but in other places too. And so if you want to fight back against the ruling class to defend your own working conditions and jobs, then that means taking on the ruling class, which is also endorsing and defending the genocide of the Palestinians. So it's, the two issues are really linked.
Yeah, I mean, I appreciate that answer, because I think here we've just seen the recent debacle with the Starmer government with their failed attempt to ram through these massive cuts to disability benefits, really attacks against the most vulnerable and poor in society. Why? Because they're feeling the pressure. Well, Britain's economy, first of all, is, just
in the toilet.
Yeah, and that's understating it. Like, it's just done. But yeah, it's in the toilet, and they have to find money from somewhere. And it's like, well, we'll just not give the disabled people the money they need. It's very, very concrete. And I think the real embarrassment that the Starmer government had to face over this question also goes to show that, yes, they have to carry out these attacks to kind of toe Trump's line. At the same time, it's not so easy for them. So just imagine that if the protest movements, the workers' movements actually took a bit of a stand, there could be potential to I don't know, maybe change the balance of forces that exist. The other thing you said, Kat, is United Front defense work, or just United Front work in general, is a means to strengthen the working class. What does that mean?
It actually goes exactly to the point you were sort of alluding to just now. It's like if you actually had, a worker, like if the workers' movement, if the unions were mobilized on the basis of, say, the rail workers or the dock workers to stop weapons shipments to Israel, and that already would send a signal to the ruling class and to the Starmer government that they're willing to fight on their own behalf. And that's what I mean by strengthening the workers' movement, and it would also, there is the question of unity in the working class, which is also really necessary. Again, like, an isolated individual is much more vulnerable than an action or, a defense or taking a stand as a union, for example. So it's.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, look, my question was, what's a communist strategy? Like, ideally, this is what we would do. Now, I think the reality is something that's quite far away from what we're talking about. I think even just hearing you talk about dock workers stopping things, it's like, well, that's really not happening. That is on another planet. I mean, maybe the occasional, actions by Italian unions or whatever. But outside of that, this is not where we're at. This is not at all. We're so far from this that it's a joke. I mean, in the US, ILA, International Longshoremen's Association, I think President Daggett hailed the strikes on Iran, and he congratulated Trump. But this is where we're at. So I guess the looming question that I've had, every time you guys have made a correct point, is why not? Why isn't this happening? What's wrong? Because, as I said, this is, United Front work sounds very commonsensical, the foreign policy of the British, American, whatever, any of these imperialist governments has direct links and implications for their attacks at home against the workers here. So why aren't we seeing more? Why aren't we seeing these kinds of militant actions that are, workers downing their tools, blocking shipments? Why aren't we seeing trade unions out in force, bringing out their memberships en masse? And this is what I'd like to spend some time talking about, the role of the left. Because as you guys mentioned at the start, we've been going to tons of demonstrations, court hearings, et cetera, and oftentimes there will be other left groups there. But we're not seeing the left groups in general to come out and take a united stand. So why aren't all these great and necessary things happening? Please explain.
I think you have to start with what is the state of the trade union movement? What is the state of the left? In both cases, very bad right now. The trade unions are pretty hollowed out. They are necessary organizations for the defense of the working class, but they do very little in terms of really defending their members, fighting for better conditions and all that. And that's a question of the leadership, because the leadership of the unions, not only in this country but pretty much everywhere, is weak and tied by 1,000 strings to the bourgeoisie in the given country. Sees the world the way the bourgeoisie does. So that whole layer of labor traders, we sometimes say, really needs to be replaced with class struggle leaders. But that's a big question. That's a big task. The left linked to that is very, very weak and demoralized, and has failed over many years to actually stand up to those trade union leaders and fight to replace them with revolutionary leaders. So that's the situation that we're in right now. And no kind of language, no fancy footwork can change that. We have to do the hard work of fighting to change that, fighting to get the rest of the left to get up off their knees, get the unions up off their knees.
Well, just to go back to Daggett, for example, on the East Coast and the Longshore Union, when you have your union president endorsing the military intervention of U.S. imperialism, i.e. of its own ruling class, they see their role as essentially a negotiation over how much or how little of the crumbs from the ruling class they can get. So sorry. There is no sense from people like that you're facing a class enemy that requires class struggle methods to fight against. Similarly here, you have people like Sharon Graham, which I know we've talked about her quite a bit, because she is really that example in the British labor bureaucracy that, when Britain implemented sanctions against Russia, she took her union out on strike because the sanctions weren't hard enough. Whereas, she doesn't lift a single finger when it comes to defending pro-Palestinian protesters, but she will take them out on strike in order to back up the foreign policy of British imperialism. So when you're dealing with people like that, then what is needed, which is why Kate, correctly made the point that to do the kind of mobilizations that we're talking about really requires a political struggle against these kinds of leaders, and replacing them with a leadership that is, a socialist leadership that is committed, or is rebuilds the union on the basis of class struggle methods. Really understanding that what is always posed is the conflict between the ruling class and the working class.
Yeah. I mean, one of my jobs in hosting these episodes is always to think, what do people not agree with when we say all these things, right? And I think you guys have made correct points about Sharon Graham and these, how wretched these trade union leaders are. I think at the same time, for example, Sharon Graham, at their recent conference, expelled Angela Rayner, right? Well, and this was quite well received by many on the left. Anyways, you mentioned that the left is in a state of weakness and demoralization. That is not something that left groups will agree with. For example, the Socialist Workers' Party, the Cliff Tendency, they recently had their annual festival, Marxism, and they wrote a report about it, and it was great. Over 2,000 people came, lots of socialist propaganda sold, and everybody came, and they recruited 200 new members, apparently, et cetera, et cetera. Excellent, successful event. Okay. Then you have, of course, the Revolutionary Communist International, who are just recruiting, no end. They're always getting more and more people, and congratulations to them. But they think that this is a period of upsurge. Across the pond, you've recently got Mamdani, who is now the Democratic Party nominee for the mayoral candidate. And a lot of the left sees this as a step forward in terms of, the sentiment to fight against the status quo. And we've talked about this elsewhere, but what I'm doing is I'm listing a series of things that people will say, what are you talking about? Left is not weak. look, there's lots of people moving to the left, we're getting stronger, et cetera, et cetera. So I want to probe that point a little bit. The weakness, which again, we have talked about elsewhere, but I think in relation to the point on defense work, why isn't there more united struggle happening? And any honest leftist will agree with this. The truth is that on the ground, no matter what these left groups say, on the ground, there is always an uphill battle to be fought in terms of doing united work, right? I know that from experience. You guys know this from experience. Why does that exist? Because I think that is where we're able to show the weakness of the left and not actually fighting to advance defense work, class struggle, etc. Because I think that lack of unity is one way to show that the left is disoriented. This is where the rubber hits the road in terms of the sort of testing the real mettle of these groups, right? They can write nice things, they can issue 100 statements or tweets or whatever you have on defend this, defend that, defend that. And these are smart people. They've read their Marx, Lenin, Engels, and Trotsky, and they know what united front work means, what the concept is, and so on. But yet, what we see is that there isn't on the ground a united front movement of the left. Why? What is your understanding of this? Because obviously, as a PDC, one of the things you guys do is reach out to these groups, right? So I assume you've met with this on a daily basis. So how do you make sense of this lack of united work?
It's worse than you know. Yeah, because as you're saying, the logical thing to do would be for all these groups to get together when someone is being picked off by the state, attacked, repressed, whatever. And often there will be words of solidarity with no action attached to it, because whatever the group is doing its own thing, they have their own priorities, and they don't see the need to unite with people with whom they have disagreements. And see, this is where a fundamental principle lies, that of united front defense work. We know there's loads of disagreements among left groups on a whole slew of questions, national questions, and how to fight racism and how to deal with the Labour Party. Every kind of question, there are differences. Fine. We're for anti-sectarian defense work, meaning you unite for a common cause, the defense of someone who's being railroaded to prison for standing up against genocide. You unite for that purpose while engaging in debate and trying to thrash out what is the way forward for the workers' movement. That's what we're for. That is not a principle that is shared in practice by most of the left, which is both a contributing factor to the weakness of the left and reflection of that weakness.
I also think it's what does the left see as its task, so aside from numbers of people recruited, what really define what is the purpose of that organization? What are your tasks in the world? And if you don't understand that the task of the left is to fight for communist hegemony over the workers' movement, then you're going to adapt in all different kinds of ways to the prevailing bourgeois ideology, whether it's liberalism in the more recent period. And I kind of wanted to take it a little bit differently too. I think we had it both in Britain as well as in the US. For example, refused to actually, when it was Kamala Harris versus Trump in the US, or here Starmer versus the Tories, when it was kind of clear that Starmer was going to win the elections, or even in Germany, the AfD was growing electorally, and a lot of workers were looking to the AfD. What did the left see as its task, And it was definitely not to actually build a opposition that could really present a different alternative to the main polarization, and really to cut through that polarization, Democrats versus Republicans, Starmer versus Farage in some ways, AfD, SPD, whatever it was. So that is another example of sort of how the left sees its own role and why therefore it is also quite weak and divided because everybody has their own sort of turf, so to speak. I don't know if that makes sense.
I mean, it makes sense in the sense that this is what happened.
Yeah.
And this is what happens, that, talking about the elections, of course, there was no united platform. Where was, outside of the two-party system, where was the third sort of alternative to the Democrats and the Republicans in the US? Where was the alternative to the pro-genocide Labour Party and the Tories in Britain, right? They were dispersed. There were many alternatives, but they were all dispersed. And in fact, in some cases, it really split the vote and benefited the Labour Party. But I guess, so I understand that in terms of empirically, that's what we saw. But again, I think the question remains of why? Because ultimately, this comes back to the tasks. Our task is to try and fight for building defense movements. Why? Because one, we want those people that are actually under the gun to be off the hook. So the more of a show of force we put up, the better it is for those individuals. But also, as you guys have been making the point, the better it is for building the unity of the working class. And so you've laid out, elements of what's needed. We've talked about the obstacles, but I think as we go deeper into this period where there's crazy attacks, political repression, turn towards militarization, everything, I can foresee that defense work is going to continue to be quite important, if not more important than it has been already. So how do you guys understand your work in the PDC? And what do you think are the ways to sort of chip away at some of the difficulties that you face in your work?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, one part of the answer is that we need to be very patient and very consistent in chipping away at these obstacles that most left groups they have their program, their activities, and they are fairly insular about that. That is not porous. They don't want to work easily with other groups. They're kind of defending their own boundaries at all times. And so they're not easily persuaded to unite across organizational lines, which is what we're trying to do and what's necessary. So we have to keep putting the case for united struggle, because it's quite obvious that when people are facing these draconian charges and repression, the more broader and stronger and more numerous a defense apparatus, the better. I'll give an example of one, a rare success in this period of United Front defense, which was our comrades in South Africa, Partisan South Africa, instigated a defense campaign for a militant trade unionist, Kalani Kosa, who was arrested for a TikTok video and was targeted because of his militant trade unionism and outspokenness. He is a member of the Economic Freedom Fighters organization. And we instigated a campaign of defense of Kalani with the EFF, and their militants of the EFF took this up. More their rank and file than their leadership took it up. And we worked together over a period of months. And just last week, we learned that the charges are being dropped, which is a victory. And as I said, a rare victory. So it is possible to do this, but you have to be very open and above board about what you're trying to do and why, and seek to work with other organizations.
I mean, if I can just respond very quickly to that, the way you're laying out, that there's this need, but you have to be patient and chip away at it. In fact, it reminded me really of doing trade union work, because in a sense, you could keep making the point, hey, this is an attack. This is more work. They're increasing your workload. Fight back, stand up, do something. But it doesn't happen. And there's a multitude of reasons for that, the sense of isolation, or the feeling that, okay, well, we're not strong enough, or God knows, there's 100 other things. But in a sense, it's not so different, that even though we can make the case of what one needs to do to stand up, push back, and, fight back. It's not always going to translate into immediate results. And our job is to, as you said, be persistent, be patient. And I think part of being patient is wait for the tide to turn a little bit. Maybe this sounds a bit passive. What I mean by that is it makes a difference how confident individuals, leftists, feel in taking a stand when there's, social struggle going on all around them, versus when they see that they're more isolated and nobody else is really doing this. I think the question of Palestine, for example, in many different types of workplaces has been quite controversial. But I think that's actually what it made me think of, that even though the reasons might be obvious, you do have to wait because a broader social context plays a role in terms of spurring one to action, or, actually exerting sufficient pressure that even those organizations, those bigger forces, are forced to take some action.
Well, I think that's true. And what it made me think about was there's often a lot of sympathy in an organization in terms of the rank and file, but the leadership is going to balk because that's where the pressure is great to be, to have our own thing and keep those walls up and all that. So we have found that, and I think you could see that in the Kalani case where there were a lot of EFF fighters who really wanted to do that work, to get in that and really defend Kalani, get the charges dropped, and the leadership was not so much. I did want to add a little bit about the trade unions, because as we were saying before, these are the organizations of defense of the working class, and they need to be involved in defending their own members first and foremost. And that gets back to the political question of the leadership of the unions is very, very tied to labor in this country, and so very resistant to doing that kind of work.
I think the other way that I sort of see our work in this period, it's really to also continue to patiently build links among, other leftists that can help sort of motivate within their own organizations the need for united front defense. And to, I think and also among trade unionists that we come across in the course of our works. I think that's an important element because, as you said, rightly, I agree that the period is really, the pressure is to be atomized and to keep your head down and to not raise a fuss or raise a stink about something. Those elements in the rest of the left that really do want, see that necessity and understand that necessity of uniting around common causes, I think those are the kinds of links that we would also like to forge so that we can take steps towards building a real united front defense effort amongst the broader left.
I think a large part of this conversation has been quite possibly depressing, or may sound like moaning about how the left isn't doing what it needs to do and how the trade unions suck and so on. Now, I know that as you mentioned with the case of South Africa, there are positive examples and signs of hope within all this doom and gloom. And I want to just briefly touch on, Kat, you did an episode about protesting repression against French activists. We held protests in many cities where we're present, and in many, if not most of those cities, we did join forces with other left groups. So I think that's another example of some of the positive that's come out of trying to be patient and persistent with a United Front Defense work. Do you want to just lay out some of what the results of that work have been?
Yeah, we held these demonstrations at the French embassies. I thought while the protest in London was not significantly huge, I think it was a real example of what we're actually talking about, which is a number of organizations. We had Anti-Capitalist Resistance, Workers' Power, the International Bolshevik Tendency and the Bolshevik Tendency, and also the RCG, Revolutionary Communist Group, also known as Fight Racism, Fight Imperialism. And one of their activists, who was a SOAS student, is facing terrorism charges for a speech she gave on campus in October 2023 in defense of Palestinian liberation. And so it was really, and also we had representatives from the Anti-Imperialist Front who read out a statement. So it was really it was a genuine united front effort, and we had a lot of discussions with comrades afterwards. And why I particularly highlight the SOAS too and their activist Sarah is because we have established a little bit of a understanding with them when we have gone to some of their protests. They also came to the protest we held in November last year for the Nigerian activists facing a death penalty. We have attended some of their protests to defend the SOAS too, and they have come to ours. And I think those are kind of the small steps that we're talking about in terms of what it means to build a united front effort. And in the US, for example, we also had a genuine united front with Left Voice, whose comrade Anas Gazib is the one being one of the cases that we were defending or protesting for at the time. So these are, it's not impossible. It does take a lot of effort, but sometimes, there is a little bit more pressure from circumstances and the course of events that really help to propel forward this effort of united front defense.
Okay. Well, my aim with this podcast was to talk about why is this happening? What communists, socialists, actually militant workers should be fighting for. And to really, I think, take head on some of the obstacles, which I think is not done enough amongst the left in general. And I appreciate specifically that, you guys are trying to grapple with that, because ultimately to build successful defense of militants, activists, etc., being gone after for very basic things, that's what it takes, And if I can, in my head, maybe you would have a different understanding, but in my head, I think what I've taken away from this is that really currently in this period, there's this vicious cycle the workers' movement or the left, whatever you want to call it, is trapped in, which is that there's a lot of repression and there's not enough being done about it. So there's more repression and still we're not seeing more that's being done about it. And at some point, that cycle needs to be broken. And I think that's one thing that I would like to impart to our listeners, that you need to recognize the state of affairs in order to understand the tasks, the implications of this for the strength of the left and the strength of the workers' movement, because today it's those guys, tomorrow it could be us, right? And I think that's ultimately also the key principle behind understanding the need for and the necessity for uniting forces in order to beat back attacks. So that's kind of, I think, what I've taken away from it, and the necessity of actually really, there needs to be a real debate. Why isn't this happening? This is the tradition of the workers' movement. Why aren't we seeing this? Because if we are to, push back in this, it's important also to look at this internationally, because this is a period of reaction. And if we want to try and put the workers' movement and put the left in a better position, it starts really by taking a stand on the most sort of basic elementary questions. So that's the lesson that I've gotten away. The other key thing is that it's not easy. So, I think it's really commendable that all of those individuals and groups and forces that are trying to do united defense work, like that's really what's needed. Is there anything else that you guys wanted to add to that?
I think in my mind, that is really succinctly the summary of what we're trying to get across.
Okay, so on that note, you can always follow our comrades, not just in Britain, but also in the US and other places. What's your handle on X?
PDC Britain.
Yeah, so follow us on X at PDC Britain, where we regularly post updates about all the crazy stuff that's happening in terms of the repression, but also what we're trying to do about it. You can find out what events we're at, what we're publishing to advance this work. So I'll link that in the show notes. And yeah, thank you very much for your time and for helping us to grapple with these questions.
Thanks, Mansa.
Thank you.
Okay, bye.
Bye.